Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Okay, so now let's get into a basic outline of the muwafaqat from an abridgment. The muwafaqat of Imam al-Shatibi, he broke it into 4 sections. Proofs, ijtihad, maqasid, and then rulings. Okay, so we talked about rulings. So he talked about ahkam. He talked about rulings in his book al-Muwafaqat. So to get to this why, he had to talk about the rulings. He also has to talk about the proofs. He had to talk about the mujtahid, but what he's most famous for, because a lot of people spoke about these other subjects, what he's most famous for is talking about the maqasid and bringing and being a pioneer in the development of discussing those overarching principles, those overarching objectives. One note to make though about this process is that this process of the ijtihad, it's already been done. So when we talk about the rulings and the ahkam and trying to match this up, we're not talking about making up new rulings. We're talking about looking at the existing rulings. This is what Imam al-Shatibi did. He didn't come and say, I want to revamp the Maliki madhab. I want to revamp the madhab system, because we know Sunni Islam is preserved through those 4 schools of thought and the scholarship that follows within that. He's not talking about revamping them. He's talking about looking at the rulings that have come through that, and looking at the usul, and then trying to find the why across the board, and that's the maqasid. Does that make sense? So when we talk about the maqasid, it's really important to remember that we're not talking about changing the ruling. So even at the level of the analysis or application, we're not talking about changing the ruling. We're not going to say the Maliki madhab is outdated, the Hanafi madhab ruling is outdated, doesn't make sense, we need a new ruling. There are certain situations that do come up that have never been addressed before that we do need a brand new fatwa. And so now what is that person, what are we to do? Right? Even if, say, we don't have a mujtahid mutlaq, or we don't have a muqayyid, we don't even have a murajjah, right? We just have people that really know fiqh and really know sharia, but they're like, I'm not even at the level of murajjah. Just to give you an idea, everybody's heard of Imam al-Suyuti, right? Imam al-Suyuti claimed ijtihad, and the scholars of his time rejected his claim. So that shows you how difficult it is to get to the level of mutlaq mujtahid. But if we're looking at all of those situations, and we're going to try to make some ruling, because Allah did not leave us to our whims, we have to make a decision. So understanding the maqasid that's another reason. It's going to help us make those applications in those brand new situations that have never happened before. But to be honest, there's very few that come through the system, because even though Imam Malik and he took the position of following suit of Umar, when people would ask Umar radiallahu anhu about hypothetical questions, he would say, just wait until it occurs, then we'll address it. Whereas Imam Abu Hanifa, him and his students, he encouraged people to talk about situations that were hypothetical. So you do get people who have analyzed that. So in the break, somebody asked about prayer on the airplane. Well, there's a question of whether or not you have to be connected to the earth for your prayer to be sound. So some modern fatwas would say it's not sound to pray on an airplane. The Malikis say, well, the Sahaba prayed on ships, and what connects the ships to the ground? Water. Well, what connects the airplane to the ground? Air. What's the difference between air and water? Are they both matter? Can you both weigh them? Do they have a mass? You know, all of those questions. So that's that. Then now you, as a recipient of all this, say, okay, I understand the Shafi'is. The modern Shafi'is who have analyzed this, and the modern Hanafis who have said prayer on an airplane is not sound because of this ruling that you have to be connected to the ground. I understand what the Malikis say. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to say the Shafi'is are wrong or the Hanafi they're more. You might have a feeling or an inclination towards one being more logically sound, but we don't have the level of ijtihad to make that determination. Does that make sense? But then the question is, what are you going to do, right, in that situation? That's where understanding the maqasid will help out. Like if we looked at the maqasid, it'll help us make that determination in our personal life. So in the maqasid, which is the maqasid of the Shari'ah, which is one of the 4 areas that Imam Shatibi talks about his books, in the maqasid he breaks it up into 4 areas. The objective of revelation of the Shari'ah in the first place. What is it there for? So just to begin with, what is the Sharia there to preserve? What is it there in the first place? The objective of the Sharia in terms of understanding, and we're going to go through a lot of examples of each one of these. How does it help us in understanding? The objective of the Sharia in terms of taklif, responsibility, that's the first one. Like, what is the objective of the Sharia in making us responsible human beings? And then the objective of the Sharia in terms of the responsible one, the mukallaf, in terms of his or her submission to that Sharia. Like, what are the objectives for that submission? So these are the first three areas. What is the objective in the first place? What is the objective for understanding? What is the intention of taklif, of responsibility? Remember Imam Shatibi's, what did he want to name the book? Inwan al-Ta'rif fi sirr al-taklif. In the secret, like, what is the secret of being responsible? And then the objective of the Sharia in making us submit to it. So let's start with the first one. The first matter, which is in terms of what is the Sharia there to preserve in the first place. And so he says that the responsibilities of the Sharia go back to the objectives of the Sharia is to preserve three main areas. And these, you're going to see them come up. Things that are called daruriyat, necessities, hajiyat. What would be a good translation? And what are they using? Just as a note, I like to use the original Arabic. I know it's because when people translate, they'll use different terms. So if we pick one English term, then the next translated person might use a different term. So it's always good when we're dealing with technical vocabulary to stick to the original. So hajiyat, which are things that are needs. So we have necessities, needs, and then tahsiniyat, completions. And I'm going to give examples. I know this is theoretical. We'll have examples. So the objective of the Sharia, the why, is to preserve these three things: necessities, needs, and completions of those needs and those necessities. One of the things he notes about that, he said, in each of these sections, as we look at it now, it's important to understand this model. He said, in each one of these things, there are things that we have to look at that establish that thing. Like, for example, a daruriyat, something that's a necessity. I'm going to necessity of life, water. Water is necessity, right? To be able to drink something. Okay, so there's something that establishes it in the first place, and then there's something that allows it to continue. And so these specific rulings are going to fit into these three areas. So there's something that establishes it, and then there's something that preserves it. Each of these three areas, with their establishment aspects and their completion aspects, apply to the 5 areas that the Sharia is there to protect. And so this is what Imam al-Shatibi, he said, if I look at all the rulings, I look at all the madhabs, I see what all of the madhabs come to, it boils down to the Sharia is there to preserve 5 things. What are those 5 things? The preservation of life. Preservation of life. Preservation, somebody said faith, we're going to call it deen, because there's faith aspects and there's action. So it's the preservation of life, the preservation of deen, what else? Property, so the preservation of mal, which is property, the preservation of lineage, nasab, and what's the 5th? And the preservation of intellect. Now, Imam al-Shatibi was the pioneer in this field of looking at this specifically. Later, people added other things, like one of the Imam al-Qarafi actually added dignity. So he added dignity, and so it became 6 primary objectives. Later scholars then added even more and more to where it became in the 10s or so forth. Ibn Taymiyyah included a lot of things. For example, he said one of the objectives is the preservation of the neighbor. So you see a lot of rulings in the Sharia, right? A lot of obligations, a lot of sunnahs, a lot of things. He said that's because there's an ultimate why of Islam. The Sharia is there to protect the rights of the neighbor. Now, when I looked at this, I said, well, that's more of a, in my personal opinion, that's more of a a specific that you could actually fit into some of the other primary objectives. So if we were to say preservation of the neighbors, all those things, what could, out of those six, if we use those six as bases, what could we plug in the preservation of the neighbor's rights through your understanding of Islam and the tradition and the sunnahs and the fard into? Like, we're preserving his life, his property, his honor. It all breaks down into that. So if we look at even of the scholars, the modern, they'll say that actually there's many more objectives. From what I've seen from that, they actually all fit into those six primary objectives. So those six. Now, if you've studied fiqh beyond just worship, if you've gone through any books of fiqh or heard discussions, when we talk about fiqh, what are the subjects that are addressed in the Sharia rulings in fiqh? What's that? Tahara. So they always start off with purification. Then what does it go to? Prayer. Then what? Zakat. Then what? Fasting. Then what? Hajj. Then what do we have in the books? Marriage. Then what else? Buying and selling. What else? Inheritance. And what else? Just one more. Zafar should answer this one since he's a public defender. Criminal law. That's it. That's the book of fiqh right there. That's the creeping sharia for you right there. It's and then before that is like aqidah. So it fits into all of those things. So if we said the preservation of deen, what is the preservation of deen? When we talk about the ibadat, right? Ibadah, your worship, your faith, that all of that discussion, every discussion you've ever heard of aqidah, every discussion you've ever heard about the fiqh of worship, fasting, prayer, it all fits into that one category of preservation of deen. The chapter on marriage, why is it there? It's in many of the books, it's the longest chapter. When I studied the Mukhtasar of Khalil in the Maliki school, studying the chapter of marriage was 7 months, nothing else. No other subject, just fiqh, and within fiqh, just marriage for 7 months. It's the longest chapter. But the whole objective of marriage and all of the rules around marriage, what does it boil down to? The preservation of what? Lineage, everything around it. That's the objective of it. The mu'amalat, buying, selling, hiring, renting, wages, loans, borrowing stuff, mortgages, collateral, putting up collateral, all of those rulings that we find, having a monopoly on things, storing things up, all of that stuff, what does it fall into the objective of? Mal, preservation of property. So that's how you can sift everything down. Then the criminal code, what does that boil down to? The preservation of life. And Allah says in the Quran, the proof for this, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ in qisas, in the hudud, right? In the penal code of Islam. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ hayat. I'm giving you life through this penal code. That's the maqsad of those things. So when people talk about, Islam is so barbaric. Islam is so barbaric. What do? We chop off hands for a thief. Now there's 7 different types of theft in Islam, in the Sharia. 7 different. Only one has amputation of the limb, and there's very specific rulings on when that would happen. But people in this country can say, you have such a barbaric code, penal code, and you chop off the hands. What we would say is you have solitary confinement. What's worse? Abdul Muhaymin, brothers, that have been in solitary confinement. What's that? Solitary confinement. I was reading an article yesterday about a person, he said he spent 6 years in prison. He never had human touch. No human touch. He said, first of all, if you touch another man, somebody might ask things. If you touch him by accident, somebody might, you have to immediately say, excuse me, otherwise something could happen, right, Abdul Muhaymin? Is that an exaggeration? If you bump into somebody in the prison, could something pop off because of it? It could. So he said, even living in his cell, which is, what are they, about 9 by 12? Even smaller? Some of them. He said, which is the closest proximity you can live to another human being. He said, in 6 years, I never touched another human being. So he felt skin deprived. He actually, the title of his article was Skin Blind. I was skin blind. And during that process, he got a hug, and he said it just showed him, during that 6 years, he got 2 hugs of another person, and he was amazed by that. But that's happening in the U.S. prison systems, where people were supporting that. We're supporting solitary confinement for decades. There's been people who have been in solitary confinement now for 30 years. If you're interested in reading about it, look about the Angola 3 and Angola prison over here in San Quentin. we're supporting solitary confinement through our tax dollars. It's much more barbaric than severing a limb. So that's just a side note. But the whole criminal code of Islam, all of those rulings, boils down to preservation of life. That's the maqsad. And so Umar, the brother mentioned earlier about Umar's holding back the severing of the limb during a famine, because Umar understood. He's like, the reason why that specific ruling was, he said there was a reason behind it. And when I see that reason doesn't line up, he's not saying this literally, but this is from his actions, we're interpreting this. He said, I can understand the maqsad of that, and so I'm going to suspend this ruling because it's not, if we implement it, it's not going to match up with the maqsad, which is preservation of life. It's just not working right now. Too many people are hungry. Too many people are stealing just to survive, and so we're going to suspend that ruling. So they go into ibadat. We also find them also in life. Other rulings. Another ruling is another chapter. What's another chapter in the books of fiqh? Diet. What can we eat? Right, the bab of mubah. What's permissible to eat, how to slaughter an animal, and so forth. All of those things, any ruling about clothing, any ruling about food, any ruling about shelter. It might come up in the chapter of marriage, it might come up in the chapter of mu'amalat, but it boils down to preservation of life. Or it could be a combination of them. So we see these discussions in the chapters of worship, about eating and drinking, which are called the adat. The mu'amalat, anytime we have an interaction. So anytime you have an interaction with another human being, whether it's a business transaction or otherwise, you're now interacting with that person. If you have a conversation with another person, let me ask this question, are our conversations governed by the Shari'ah? Right? In what we can say, in what we shouldn't say, in what we could say, but it might not be best to say. All of that's happening in this interaction with this other person. That's part of the mu'amalat, and then we have the jinayat, which are the code. So, as an example, in the ibadah, we have faith, the shahadatain, the prayer, zakat, fasting. All of those things work to, they're there for the preservation of our deen. Okay, so that's one of the first main points that he points. Is that clear? That point right there. So the second point he says is that every one of these levels. So now we have daruri, necessities, needs, and tahsiniyat, completions. Necessities, needs, and completions. Every one of these applies in all of those 5 or 6 categories, and everyone has a base, and it has something that's completing it. And he's going to give us some examples. So everything has something to complete it. It's important to know that certain rulings are there for the completion of the asl, because if that completion is removed, if for some reason we're not able to implement that completion, it does not affect the foundational ruling. And as an example, he mentions the idea of an eye for an eye. An eye for an eye. That's part of our deen, right? In the qisas, within the qisas, is an eye for an eye. Now, if retribution, somebody attacks somebody and physically harmed them, if the judge were to allow physical harm of any nature back to the person, could we say justice is served at its foundational level? Like say he inflicted, we're going to put it on pain on a scale of 1 to 10, like they do at the hospitals, right? I watch comedians, and some of the there's one man named Brian Regan. He doesn't do vulgar. Anybody ever watch his stuff? Brian Regan? He doesn't do vulgar humor, he doesn't use curse words, but he makes basic things in life like hilarious. So he was talking about the pain scale and like how do you judge that, and like if you anyway, he has a whole routine about the pain scale. But if we use the 1 through 10 pain scale and we say this person inflicted on this other person pain of 8, and if we give 8 back to that person on the 8, we could say that at some level, would we say that justice has been served? At some level. But an eye for an eye is a completion of that. When we do exact matching of the thing. If literally, وَالْعَيْنُ بِالْعَيْنِ سِنُّ بِالسِنِّ, you knocked his tooth out, you're going to get a tooth knocked out. It's going to be exact. And so this ruling falls under the category of the preservation of life through the jinayat, but it's a completion to the asl, which is retribution, qisas. Qisas is retribution. Eye for an eye is a completion of that. If we remove the completion from the picture, we still have the foundation. As an example, okay. Well, now he gives examples of, we had those three categories: necessities, and then hajiyat, and then also tahsiniyat. So in hajiyat, a completion would be a commensurate wage. So just move that down. One thing that you'll see a lot in the Sharia is commensurate wage. Ujratul mithil. They'll say sadaqul mithil, commensurate. A commensurate, or I don't know if that's a good term, but basically, say two people get married, and then they have a dispute later about their dowry. One of the things that the fuqaha would have to look at is, was this a commensurate of a woman of her status in society? So if a man gets married and gives a dowry, can we say that that initial level of the foundation of giving the dowry is given? The foundation is there. To make it commensurate with a woman of her status, that's a completion of this hukum. It doesn't mean that we remove it. It's just like, how are we looking at? It's important to break the Sharia down so that we can get to the why that's behind there. So, as an example, commensurate wage as an example. In certain countries, and I've experienced this in Mauritania, you can hire somebody and he won't tell you how much to pay him. Or even here, I'm sure, who's been to a place where you try to hire somebody and he won't tell you how much to pay him, right? Okay, so we've experienced that. Now, say you take your car to somebody, he does a job for you or whatever. Now it comes down to, does this person have to pay you? Yes, you have to pay him. You have to give him a wage, which that's the foundation. But if we now are in dispute, okay, it's 1,000. No, I need more. I want 2,000. Well, you didn't say anything, and I think 1,000 is fair. At that point, we look at the commensurate wage. We would say, what would be an equivalent for this job? And then we say, this is what is going to be the ruling here. So the obligation, it's an obligation to give the commensurate wage, to give the commensurate dowry. But if it wasn't commensurate, could we say that something was given? Right? It's not non-existent. He gives them, so they get into a contract. He doesn't say anything. The guy's expecting 2,000. This person's expecting to give 1,000, but the commensurate is at 1,500. If he gives 1,000, something was given. It's not in a state of non-existence, but it's not at the commensurate. And this is daruri. So this is in the level of daruri. This has to be given. Yes. The difference between necessity and need. He's gonna talk about. Well, actually, did I skip that? Okay, so the difference between necessity and need is the necessary things are, if they are absent, that thing is absent. So, as an example, for life, food and water. So, could we say that you could live without medicine? Right? Pretty much you can live without. There are certain situations where medicine can prolong your life, but could a person get through a sickness without medicine? It's happened by convention. But could we say somebody could get through life without food or water? So food and water are considered at the level of daruriyat. Hajiyat would be things that are needs. So let's take the prayer for example. A daruri of the prayer is the Fatiha. A haji of the prayer is the sunnah recitation. A tahsini, a completion, would be all of those adabs and the extra things. That if those extra things are there, it does not affect if the haji is not there, it doesn't affect the daruri, and so forth. If the tahsini, if the completion is not there, it doesn't affect the need being there, and it doesn't affect the daruri. Does that answer your question? So food is an example, but having cooked food might be considered a haji. We could look into that, but we don't base this on conjecture. We're not putting these through on our life. We're looking or on our through our experience or through our intellect. We're looking at what is in there in the Sharia rulings, and then now we're trying to fit them into this category: daruri, tahsini, or haji. It's not based on our intellect. It's based on, it's already there, but we're going to try to match these up. So an example for the daruri prayer would be a daruri at the level of the deen is the congregational prayer, or sorry, a completion. So the congregational prayer it's a completion of the daruri. So if we pray dhuhr by ourselves, did we fulfill the daruri? But a completion of that daruri is praying in jama'ah. But if that jama'ah is not there, we still have the daruri. So these all fit into a category. One of the reasons now we'll understand, and this comes up in people asking questions, prohibition of drinking a little bit of alcohol. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, I mean, if it doesn't get you drunk, what's the big deal? And just out of curiosity, has anybody ever heard somebody might have said that? You have. Okay, so so they're looking at the point of the prohibition of alcohol is about intoxication. But the Sharia is saying no, and the Hadith says, like, you know, if a lot of it will get you drunk, then a little of it is haram. So if we know this is the Sharia ruling, that a little bit is haram, then how do we fulfill that into the system? That this is a completion of the foundational. So the foundational thing is prohibition of alcohol and the prohibition of intoxication. But because this is here, this is tacked on to that also as another separate. Almost look at it as like a separate haram thing. So yes, getting intoxicated is haram, and drinking alcohol is also haram. But if you just drink a little bit of alcohol, would you get drunk? No, you wouldn't. But these two things, they're connected. So we can look at them as separate. And what this helps us as is that so that when the person comes and says, well, a little bit won't hurt, we say this is a completion. This is a daruri completion of that daruri foundation. So yes, we see your argument. We see the argument that you're presenting to us, that you're not going to get drunk by drinking this small amount of alcohol, but it's in the same category. It's just a completion of the foundational ruling. Then he gives examples in the hajiyat, also in the tahsiniyat. So in the hajiyat, the needs, he mentions joining prayers as an example. So the Sharia is there and has allowed for us to join prayers in travel, unless you're Hanafi, right? And has also allowed the sick person to join prayers. What that means is that you can pray dhuhr at the very end of the time and asr at the very beginning of the time. So it looks like you're joining prayers, but you're actually just praying them each in their own time. But the Sharia has allowed for that. So if the Sharia has allowed for joining the prayers, it's not considered a necessary, or the way it's been categorized, it's not a daruri. It's not so necessary that we have to join the prayers. This has just been an allowance that has been made that, hey, if you want it, it's going to complete this need. It's not a necessity. Now, if there are things that have to complete having the prayer in the first place, that's going to put it in the category of a necessity. It's not is joining prayers a necessary for being able to pray while traveling? No, it's not. So it's considered in the hajiyat. It's a need, but doesn't it make things easier for the Shafi'is or other people who take the Shafi'i or the Hanafis who take the Maliki opinion, right? Doesn't it make things a lot easier? So that's considered like a need. The tahsiniyat would be, as an example, like all of the adab of using the restroom. So a daruri, the hukum is, yes, you have to use the restroom. Because if there's people can die, like especially if they have a medical condition where those matters stay in the body, they could die. So is it daruri to use the restroom? Yes. But a tahsini, a completion of that, would be following the sunnah when using the restrooms. That's where it falls into that category. And I actually know a young man, he had just finished memorizing the Quran. He was about 12 years old. And this is in Mauritania, he ate something and it caused severe constipation. And this is out in the Badia, to where they don't have a Rite Aid or a Walgreens or a CVS to be able to go and just get some basic things. And it stayed like that for a week or 10 days and he died. Like that's the reality that people that don't have basic, laxatives, basic, if people die from dysentery. I mean, I didn't see this firsthand. I've known people who have died from tuberculosis, TB. You don't really hear about that in America, unless in the prisons, right? They have TB outbreaks in the prisons, but you don't hear about that in America. So those are that just came to mind when we think about like relieving ourselves. We don't necessarily think of it as being a daruri, a necessity of life, but it is. And for this reason, one of the ulama said that when you go to the restroom, if you want to get the reward of an obligatory action, make the intention, I'm fulfilling an obligation. Because it's an obligation to keep ourselves alive. Okay, so those were so the second point he mentions is okay, and I think this is a practical, because I know some of this is a bit theoretical, so it's hard to grasp. But he said, so the third point is that every completion has a condition. Okay, so we talked about those three areas, and we said they all have foundational aspects and they have completion aspects. The completion aspect can never affect the foundational aspect. So that's where we break it away. So that's why it's also important to recognize that these are two separate obligations within the same obligation. So the rule is one, but there's two things. So as an example, najasa, filth. Is it permissible to consume it? So that's haram. Preservation of life. Is it an obligation? So now we have two obligations that are butting heads in the instance where najasa could actually cure this person. So the only medicine that you have is alcohol. The only medicine that you have has some sort of filth mixed into it. They're like, here's some medicine and it's got some pork into it. Or it's got something that might not be filth, but it's an intoxicant. Before recreational marijuana was legal in this country, in this state, California, I went with, there was a sheikh visiting from Mauritania, and he went to the doctors, and so he was experiencing pain, and I was translating at the time. I was asking about, out of curiosity, I said, because this was just recently after, I don't know how recent, after medical marijuana was approved. So I asked the doctor, I said, so could you prescribe this? This was within Kaiser. She said, oh yes, would he like some? She got ready to prescribe him medical marijuana for the sheikh for his pain. And she said, and I can prescribe it in pill form. I was like, no. And I translated to the sheikh. It's like, a'udhu billah. He wouldn't want the medical marijuana. But if we have a situation where, and I know I'm not speaking on the medical, I'm just jumping out of my, what do they call it? Not the area of expertise, your field, what is it? Your content area? There's a word for it. Yes, your competency scope. But I have heard of people saying that it's medical marijuana is reducing seizures, and people that have a lot of seizures, it helps them function in life and so forth. So if we have that situation where we have an intoxicant, or somebody's choking on something and he has to drink alcohol, like the only thing that's going to wash that thing down is a bottle of, that's the only thing he has around there, a bottle of vodka, right? They filled up the water bottle with the vodka. That's a recurring theme. I also have to be careful. There's therapists in the audience, so I might, they might be noticing some of the recurring themes in the jokes that I make. But if we have those two things, preservation of life and avoidance of filth, butting up against each other, then now which one overrides the other one? So this is why they said staying away from najasa is a completion. Can we live? This is the question that they ask. Can you live even if you consume najasa? Right? Pork, alcohol. Can you still live? Can you live if you don't have this medicine that happens to be najasa in that situation? Like say the alcohol it's not even medicinal. Just say alcohol and you're choking on something and that's the only liquid that you have to wash down this thing. Could you live? And they're like, look, in this situation, he's most probably going to die. So this is considered a completion. Like avoiding that filth is considered a completion, and the preservation of life in this situation is considered foundational. So that's why the scholars allowed for the use of najasa in medicine. So this is where they're trying to find the objectives, where they're saying, okay, Imam al-Shafi'i allowed for, or actually all of the scholars, they had They each of them, Imam Malik, Abu Hanifa, and Imam Shafi'i, they all allowed for najasa in medicine, but they each had very specific rules on what najasa could be used and how it could be used. Does that make sense? But the overarching principle, that's what Imam Shatibi is saying, they're all trying to preserve life and avoid filth. That's the two objectives that's going on in their thinking process that produces separate rulings. So when you hear that the Shafi'is allow for all kinds of medicine, najasa, except alcohol. The Hanafis allow for any type of najasa if it's medicinal. Imam Malik says no medicine. The later Maliki, no najasa in medicine, and he uses as a proof. The Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has not put our cure in the haram. Okay, so that's his proof. That's his principle. So what? So now we have three. Malik says no najasa in medicine. Shafi'i says everything except for alcohol. Abu Hanifa says everything is permissible. How do they do that? Imam Shafi'i says that hadith that says Allah has not placed our medicine, our cures in what is haram. The haram there is talking about alcohol. So everything else, pork, dead animals, anything else is allowable except for alcohol. Imam Malik said no, this is absolute. Allah is saying your cure is not in the haram. That's why I made it haram. I've got cures in other things, so find that other cure. Abu Hanifa is saying, and Imam Shafi'i is saying, what that means is that Allah has not placed our cure in the haram, meaning that when our cure is in the haram, it's no longer haram. Does that make sense? So this is all happening under one hadith. You got what is the ruling? How are they deriving it? But Imam Shatibi is trying to say what's going on here. So Imam Malik is they're all in agreement. We all look for preservation of life. A transaction out of necessity. So if the only way to survive, or the only way to survive is through an invalid transaction, which they're all over the place. Once you start studying the rules of transactions, the majority of what we engage in has some problem at one level or another. And I'm not talking about a conventional mortgage from a bank to buy your house. Not that. Not the typical convention question that's asked. There's a lot of things. As an example, 30-day money-back guarantees. According to the Sunnah, what's the money-back guarantee? If anybody's familiar with it. What's that? 3 days. 1 day or 3 days. That's what we find in the Sunnah. So some scholars said that's all that's allowable. So every time we buy something, we put this 30-day guarantee, we're already, according to some scholars, that's an invalid transaction. Other scholars would say, well, it's allowable or it's excusable. There's a whole, this is not a fiqh class. I'm not going to throw things out and say, oh, should I stop shopping at Walmart or Target? No, I'm saying right now, the way we live, is it next to impossible to buy from a person without having some sort of money back guarantee, right? Unless you go to those Arabs in the mall. And look, I'm half Jordanian, so I can speak on my people. Arab, they don't want to give money back, right? Right, Murad? Once they sell stuff, no money back guarantee. Everybody else in the marketplace is giving money back guarantees. Costco will take stuff that's even used, right? But the Arab, no. Once that money is in my register, you're not getting it back. That might sound racist. Is it racist? Yeah, problem. Okay. So for the most part, but anyway. So that's a separate. But if we recognize that our daily functioning in society, the way society is now, that it's going to be very difficult, next to impossible, to stay away from transactions that might have something that's doubtful or maybe haram, then at that point we look at that condition, that invalid condition, as a completion to the original bay'ah. So then we can say having a valid transaction, or let's put it like this: to live in life, do we have to have transactions? Right? We have to. It's a daruri. That's a given. I have a jar of seashells on my or river shells. They use in some parts of Africa. They used to trade in like shells. So a friend of mine who was from Mali, studied in the same mahdara that I did, he actually gave me a jar. He's like, my grandmother used to use these as currency. So I have those on my desk saying, like, it's gone from, used to be seashells, now we just paper money, and then we have Bitcoin. Now it's going cryptocurrency, but it's all currency. So even if you're trading shells for a basket, that's a transaction, right? If you go over here to the Ohlone Indians, right, they had things that they would use to the museum to learn about. They had things that they have a transaction. So the Sharia recognizes that transactions are a necessity of life, but having a valid transaction, that's a completion, that's a daruri completion of this daruri asl. But if the two go up against each other, we can separate the necessity of having a valid transaction while still maintaining the transaction that is necessary for life. Does that make sense? So now that's where, if people say, well, I heard all these different shuyukh say these different fatwas on riba, that's essentially what we're getting down to. That's the question. I'm not going to come out here and say it is haram to buy a conventional mortgage or it is halal to buy a house on a conventional mortgage. That's not what I'm saying right now. What I'm saying is both of those fatwas are within this scope. They all have the same objective. They're saying preservation of life and preservation of wealth. Can you live without it? And even if you can't live at the daruri level, then there's a tahsini level. So this goes into your question. How do we define those? So, like for example, in buying a house, if we say it's super hard to get a house without a conventional mortgage, and this is, let's say, putting aside the Islamic finances, but if we were really to get ahead, because there's a lot of issues in the development of Islamic finance, but if we were to say as a community, if we really need to move forward, we should all buy houses on conventional mortgage, and we should all support our businesses on conventional mortgage, right? If you want to open up a clinic, if you want to do a school, could we develop as a community a lot faster if we just all went conventional mortgage? In terms of building schools, in terms of building infrastructures, in terms of endowments, could we move a lot quicker? Okay, so now the question is there is a necessity, there's a darura, how far are we going to stretch that? So the Sheikh gave me a fatwa to be able to buy a house and a darura. Am I going to buy in Mission Hills or am I going to buy in East Palo Alto? Are they both houses? So that at the darura level, it's established. But then there's some hajiyat that we need to also analyze. Is living in East Palo Alto going to be the same as living in Mission and Fremont? It's not. So that's where the discussion now has to come in terms of us at the analysis or the application. We're saying, okay, all these rulings of the madhahib are out there. All these fatwas are out there. How am I going to now, I need to be able to sift through this. Is this at the darura level? Is this at the haji level? Or is it this at the tahsini level? And I think it's time for, is this going to be a little bit longer break, like a 10-minute break? 5 more minutes? Okay, so 5 more minutes. Okay, the last point that I find in here, and then I'll open it up just for questions, is basically if we look at the necessities, then the needs, then the completions, each one feeds into the previous one. The completion, it completes the need. The need completes the daruri. But if we can't ever negate one of those previous ones for the establishment of this one. So if we have to, like an example they give is amputating a limb for the preservation of life. Okay, so there's an example. Like it's permissible in the Sharia. It would actually be obligation in the Sharia to amputate that limb. So if somebody says, if you don't amputate this limb, the infection is going to spread to the rest of your body. And so having that limb, can you live without that leg? Yes. So this leg is in the tahsin, is in the haji area. You can live without a leg. And so if keeping that leg, which is a haji, it's a need. We need to have legs, but it's not a necessity. If keeping that leg is going to affect the necessity, then we sacrifice the need. And so these are themes that you'll see coming up in the Sharia as you hear rulings. But this is not for something. This is not based on conjecture or personal opinion. What ruling falls into which category? This is Imam al-Shatibi and later developing the scholars who developed this subject, who are looking at the Sharia and trying to match things up. Any questions? Yes. Right. So the hajiyat are things that complete they complete those. So for example, like in worship, it's like the sunnahs within the prayer, or the legs for the body, or the staying away from the food. It's basically something that it's needed, but its absent does not affect the existence of the other thing. Let's see if he gives some other. So like the commensurate dowry. As an example, there's a difference of opinion whether or not transaction sales are from daruriyat or from are they from hajiyat. So that shows you like what the hajiyat is something basically. Can we live without business transactions? If we say yes, can you live off the grid and go out there in the mountains and just live out there? Is that possible? So if we're going to argue that, then we're going to put transactions into the level of hajiyat. It's a need, it's not a necessity. But the others would say no, that might be theoretically possible and maybe in a rare circumstance, but overall for humanity to continue, it doesn't make sense. So we're going to put transactions into the level of necessity. It's a needed. So that does that example help in the definition? Mm-hmm. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Well, so the question was the definition of hajiyat are about prevention of harm or getting a benefit. From what I've seen, that's mentioned that the entire one scholar, and I can recommend his lecture series. It's in Arabic, but he says if you want to look at this entire subject, all of these categorizations and everything, even the taklif, it's all about preventing harm and bringing benefit. That's the highest level. Like the primary of the objective of the Sharia is to prevent harm and to bring benefit. So I don't know. I'd have to look at and see how he put that specifically within the hajiyat, because according to Imam Shatibi's placement, Dar'ul Mafasid wa Jalb al-Masalih, it goes at all these levels. So you can apply it at the. So if we were to say the adab of the prayer, like all of the extra sunnahs and etiquettes of the prayer, does that bring benefit? Yeah, there's a benefit that comes with that. So even at the tahsini level, there's a bringing of benefit, and there's a prevention of harm. In every bringing of benefit, there's a prevention of harm, and vice versa. One more question? Yes. Yeah. Ends up at the same thing. Yeah. Oh, good question. What would be the question was about Sharia compliant mortgages versus conventional mortgages, and that sometimes that in one sense they're the same, and the minor differences is like a technicality, because they could both lead to a foreclosure. You could both lose your money on the house. What would be the maqasid behind the two? That's a very good question, and it goes back to, are we going to approach this as an ijtihadi issue, or are we going to approach this as an application issue? So if we say within that first thing, if we say, are we going to look at the maqasid and open up the door of ijtihad, in the sense that we're going to say, okay, the Shafi'is say this, Malikis say this, Hanafis say this, but we need a new ruling. We need a new ruling that negates those previous rulings. That's one approach that some people are taking, and you'll see this a lot, especially in the translations and the people who are talking about the maqasid. The other approach, and this is what I think is more accurate, is to say we're going to leave the rulings as is, but there is this built within the Sharia, the idea of ad-darurat tubih al-mahdhurat, that necessities permit the impermissible. So now our question is, at the end result, it's going to be the same. We're either going to say yes, we're going to do the mortgage or not. But the question that we have is, are we going to recognize this as being such a necessity that we are going to just say, I'm eating this pork out of life survival. like that. Like, I'll give an example. One of the specific rulings, and this really shocked me when I read it. But then after a while, I said, okay, I have to, I have to accept this ruling. It comes out of the ijtihad of the Maliki school. And then after learning about refugee work and seeing the realities of the people live, I can see how this ruling comes into play. The ruling is, if a woman is in need of support and she's going to die otherwise, can she put herself in prostitution? Okay, that's a serious subject, right? The reality is, are there people right now living that reality? They are. They are. We've met them in Jordan. Like, we met them in Jordan right now. Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, people who are in that. You can see the articles, the food distributors. They're asking for everything under the sun in terms of favors, all levels. So is it permissible for her? It's haram for the person, but is it permissible for her? Is it like eating a dead animal if there's no other food? If she's saying the only way for me to support myself and to support my family is through this. The Rohingyas are now facing that too. They're facing that too. There's a documentary on Al Jazeera about it. That's what Muslims are doing to our Muslim sisters in there. Sometimes for $3 a day. $3 a day. So it also calls us into question, like, what are we doing? Like, are we, in addition to making sure that aid is getting to those situations, are we making sure that these women are protected? There was a woman that we met in Jordan who, this is another way that the prostitution is happening, or what we could call prostitution, in that a woman goes to an area, she rents out the basement or a small room for her and her children because the man is dead or missing. A lot of these stories are happening. And then she has only a certain amount of rent. After a few months, there's no more rent, and then the landlord literally tells her, well, there's other ways you can pay the rent. It's happening right now. Now, man, we met people that are like in this situation. So the question then becomes, is if this is the only way that she can survive, is it permissible for her in that situation? And the Malikis mentioned that this would be permissible for her in that situation. So I don't know how I got off onto the ribawi question. But the point is that in these situations, in these daruriyat situations, we have to weigh these out and say which one is going to take precedence. Okay, so, but it's not permissible. It's not that the person is saying this is now halal for you. We're saying this is haram, but it's permissible to do the haram so you don't get a sin. So it's out of darura that it's happening. So what I argue for in America is, if we're going to look at that, we don't change the ruling and say riba is permissible, but we say, is it a necessity, and at what level do we need it as a necessity? That's the question that we should be asking. And that's where the fatwas are. You see some people saying, like, for example, has anybody seen the fatwa that says riba is permissible because this is darul harb? Who's seen that? Right? This is permissible. And there's a lot of issues with that fatwa, and I can begin because that includes riba and alcohol sales. So, but if we take the other approach, we're saying, we're not saying that this is permissible in its asl, we're in its foundational, because in that fatwa it's saying it's permissible. You don't even have to ask a question about it, and that's what some of the fatwas are coming out for. The other one is saying, no, it's not permissible, but is it a darura? Do we need it for the advancement of our personal, of our communal, of our societal lives as Muslims going forward? So I don't know if that answers your question. Because you said, how does the maqasid play into this? So I think that would be like, if in terms of the maqasid, if we say preservation of wealth, when we're making an analysis or application, because this is a new situation. Muslims living in this society, and we're trying to be involved in the economy. Is it enough of a necessity? Then we have to say, how much do we have to engage in to preserve our life, to preserve our wealth, and so forth? Did I answer the question or no? Or give you some insight? Oh, okay. I think I see what you're saying. And maybe since we have to break, we can pick that up. But I want to, and I'll start this in the next session. Is one of the things that it's important to understand about the maqasid is understanding: is there a reason behind this ruling, or is it ta'abbudi? That's a really important distinction to me. Like, if is there a reason behind the prohibition of riba, or is it just because Allah said it and we do it? And an example of a ta'abbudu, why is Maghrib 3 rak'ahs and Fajr is 2? Or Dhuhr is 4 and it's silent? Now, like, is there a reason? Because if we assign a reason that once to it, then once that reason is removed, the hukum will change. But that's if it's reason. But if it's a worship-based hukum, then that's it. We can't change it. So that's a discussion that has to be had. Is the prohibition of riba, is it illah based or is it ta'abbudi based? But even that assignment of that role, it has to come from within the Sharia. But we can pick that up inshallah after the break.